They had salted the ramparts of Winterfell until the snow squeaked underfoot and the torches sent up little ghosts of steam in the dark. The hall smelled of pine and wet wool and roasting mutton. Outside, the wind fretted at the banners on the walls and worried its thin howl through the crenels. Inside, firelight picked copper out of goblets and sent shadows long and thoughtful down the tables. The North had been fed and armed and hardened by defeat and victory alike, and yet a look of listening had fallen over it, as though every man and woman present were attuned to a sound beyond the wind. Snow or drums or the scrape of dead things. Brienne stood near the fire because even in summer from birth she'd taken cold quickly, and winter in the north reached through plate and padding with the intimacy of illness. Her cloak steamed and smoked as it dried. Podrick Payne, pink-faced and careful as ever, had taken off her gauntlets and was wiping the worst of the melted snow from them with a scrap of linen. He tended Oathkeeper the way a hedge priest might tend a relic. It embarrassed her and warmed her both. Jon Snow had called her into council only with Sansa and Davos. Ghost, pale as drift and darker-eyed than any storm, lay with his massive head on his paws near the Lord's chair, more shadow than substance when the light wavered. Jon stood with his hands braced on the back of the carved chair, eyes lowered as if to listen to the grain of the wood, or to the living weft of the old god's trees beyond the walls. He had the look of a man who has begun to understand the measure of the burden he's been carrying, and also the measure of himself. That steadied her more than his king's crown, which was a simple circlet and looked as if it had been hammered out of winter itself. "I don't know the South," he said without preface. "I know some of its lies. I know some of its kindnesses. I know that they are men and women, and we are all in the same story whether we wish to be or not." Sansa lifted her goblet without sipping, turning it in her hands. Firelight glanced like fallen gold along the edge of her smile, which was not a smile at all, merely the barest quirk of mouth and memory. "The South knows us," she said. "They know our stories too. They remember my father as the stern one who wouldn't bend. They remember Robb as the boy who won too much too quickly until he didn't. They remember me as a hostage who sang to please a queen. They remember Catelyn Stark who wanted the Riverlands safe for her children and laced that wish with mercy until her mercy was used against her. They will remember Winterfell returned to Stark hands. They will test whether we are children still." Davos Seaworth, who had seen kings made on rough beaches, rubbed his thumb along a nick in the table. "They'll take the weather with salt. They'll take the truth with wine. But you don't sail into a strange harbor without someone who speaks the tongue and knows the shoals." Sansa's gaze slid, deliberate as a blade, towards Brienne. "We have someone the South respects, or should, if honor is not a dead language there." Brienne felt her heart go still and heavy. She had stood in ruined castles before, with the ghosts of oaths around her, and had this sensation then, as though the words themselves, vow, pledge, loyalty, were iron debtor's chains she had clasped about herself, willingly, and never expected to be free of. She thought of Catelyn Stark's hands folded around hers, of Sansa's quiet acceptance on the day they'd met in the snow, of Renly smiling, clean-shaven, sunlight turning his hair into a medal he wore without knowing. "You mean me," she said, because she would not pretend otherwise. Jon nodded. "If you'll take it. I am yours to command," she said, the simple truth of it tasting sharper than pride and cleaner than fear. "No," Sansa said gently, and touched Brienne's wrist where the hair raised in the cold. "You were my mother's. You swore to me, but I also trust you to tell me when to be silent and when to speak. Go south, Brienne. Go to your father. Go to Highgarden if they'll receive you. Go to Old Town if you must. Find Dorne if you will. Tell them winter is not a northern word. Tell them the dead are not a northern fancy. Tell them that if they love the living, they must not let the North be alone. Take my letters," Jon said. "Take my name if it will open doors or close mouths. We need grain and we need ships. We need men who are not fools. We do not need oaths they will break when it is convenient, nor gold that asks us to bend the knee to slaughterers. And if you meet Ser Jaime Lannister," Sansa added, and Brienne's breath altered before she could steady it, "remind him that a broken oath can be mended by action. He owes you something. He knows it. Ghost lifted his head then and stared at her with the old, wild patience of things that had watched snow fall longer than men had had names. Brienne reached without thinking to rub her thumb along the edge of Oathkeeper's pommel, where the diamonds were tiny and hard and cold as stars. Golden lion heads had once gripped a blade shaped from a murdered Stark sword, and the thought never left her. Swords remembered, so did hands. "I'll go," she said. "I'll go and I'll ask and I'll return." Davos smiled without humor. "Go and do more than ask. Go and make them see what's at stake. And take Podrick," Sansa said, glancing at the boy with a smudge on his cheek and a look like he would stand in front of a dragon if she asked him without asking why. "He listens well and remembers everything he hears." "I do try, my lady," Podrick said, the words escaping him like a bird who did not expect its own song. "Be careful," Jon said to Brienne, which was the most useless and kind thing one could ever say. "Bring back what you can. Bring back what is true." They left at dawn 3 days later with the snow hard as old bread under the hooves and a light like pewter poured over everything. They had 4 men with them who knew the Dreadfort Road and the longer way east, and 2 of the Mormont's bear boys who had never been farther south than White Harbor and took the news as if it were beer, dark and promising. Brienne wore the cloak Sansa had pressed on her shoulders, a winter white that would be gray before the first week ended, and beneath it her armor, riveted and mended and honest. She felt the weight of Oathkeeper across her back and another, older weight inside her breastbone that had no name and needed none. They made White Harbor in 8 days, which was better than prudence and worse than luck. They skirted men with pale rags tied to their spears that might have been Bolton remnants and might have been none, and once a wolf pack ghosted them all afternoon, keeping pace but not pressing. When at last the green and white merman of House Manderley came up above the palisades and the smell of salt tumbled over everything like a younger, rougher wind, Brienne felt the part of herself that was still a girl from Tarth lean towards it so hard it hurt. She could taste sapphire summers and the thumbs of her hands split from climbing wet rocks, and beyond that the dreams she had once had of open water with no shore and a life that was her own. Wyman Manderley received them before the fire in a chair that made other chairs look like stools, and his laugh shook all his chins like a delighted pudding. That was how the West would tell his story, Brienne thought, as it always had. A fat man eating, a fat man drinking, a fat man bidding men to cut another slice. They would neglect the sharpness in the eyes and the precision with which he placed his words, like a master mason setting river stones in lime. "Lady Brienne of Tarth," he said, "whose sword is made of stark steel and whose loyalty is a thing songs used to mean before they fell in love with lies. You are welcome. And you, boy of the Pains, who once wore too big a helm and dreamed he could stand among knights without their laughter cutting him small. You're growing into your dreams, I see." "Your lordship is kind," Podrick said, flushing as if he'd swallowed wine too fast. "Kind?" Manderley chuckled. "No. Merely old enough to remember what courage looks like when it is not wearing a famous name." His eyes came back to Brienne. "Our king wants grain and ships and the gift the South finds hardest to send. Decent regard. I can give you 2 cogs without their bellies full and a way south that won't drown you if the gods are in a temper. I can give you letters with my seal and more with my tongue, since tongues travel faster than parchment. I can't give you men I don't have, but you'll find men in the neck who still owe the Starks their lives, if you know where to tug at the reeds." Davos appeared from somewhere in the weave of Manderley men and low talk, and Brienne felt unexpected ease at the set of his shoulders, which were permanently braced against one more bit of bad news. "I'll see you to the cogs," he said. "They're ugly as old boots. That's how I like them. Pretty ships are for princes and pirates." "I am neither," Brienne said. "You are what you are," Davos said. "And I've seen princes who weren't fit to carry a bucket for you." The sea sent up its old roar when they walked out to the quay, the kind of sound that sets the teeth on edge if you don't love it and fills the ribs if you do. The cogs were stain-dulled and slabby and honest, their crews a mix of boys with fish-scale hands and men with eyes narrowed into new wrinkles by decades of glare. Brienne looked at the canvas, which was patched and wintered with salt. She had sailed with men who loved wind and those who merely endured it. These were the latter. Good. They put out under a sky low and the color of iron. Manderley's harbor pilots slid them between the sandbars and the hidden teeth where the white knife met the sea. And then the land sagged into a line of blue-gray knitting and the water began its deep persuasion at the equanimity of the stomach. Brienne anchored her feet and let her weight move with the ship. Podrick turned green, gray, then pink, and then green again, as reliable as a banner turning in a faithful wind. The first day was only wind and the creak of wood and men swearing at ropes. The second day gave them a smear of black on the horizon that turned into shapes that men with the breath to shout named before they needed to. Longships, iron-born, with their lean, silent hulls and the arrogant, beautiful lines of their terrible turning. Brienne had lately learned to measure herself against horses and men. Now she measured herself against a deck that moved beneath her like a beast on a chain, and against the sharp quickness required to make a shield become a wall and a sword become a word that meant not yet. Not yet, not yet, until the ship you loved was clear. The Ironborn came with hooks to bite the rail and voices that wanted blood. Brienne's breath went narrow and useful, and Oathkeeper said what it was meant to say. Men shouted sapphires, like a curse she had not heard in years, and she smiled a small bitter smile because she had a castle full of sapphire summers in her veins and none of it had ever bought her acceptance. She cut a hook's rope with one blow, took another on the flat of her blade and shoved it off with her shoulder, and when a man with a kraken on his breast leaped the last stretch between the ships, she met him with a blow as clean as a tolling church bell. Podrick fought beside her, small and fierce and slightly frightened, which made him careful. 2 Manderley sailors died with their mouths open as if trying to catch breath that had no interest in being caught. The Ironborn had not been expecting a knight in full plate on a Manderley cog, nor a knight who moved like the sea didn't own her. Their puzzlement cost them seconds that cost them lives. A wave slid a longship aside like a toy, and broke 2 of its men between hull and hull. Another threw spray across the deck so that everything was slick, and a man went down and did not get up again because someone else needed the ground just then. It was short and loud, and after, there was blood in the salt and men counted hands and teeth and knives as if they could inventory grief. When their pursuers fell away, sullen as winter gulls cheated out of their fish, Podrick sat with his back to the mast, eyes wider than they had been yesterday, as if the world had forced itself larger than he'd thought and he had to take that in through pupils. Brienne wiped Oathkeeper clean with a square of sailcloth and handed the cloth to a sailor who had learned years ago to make value out of what he had. "You've done well," she told Podrick. "I was only scared enough to be useful," he confessed, then looked ashamed at the confession. "Useful is the only measure worth measuring," she said, and the sailor laughed and said she spoke like a man who'd kept ships off rocks without profits and thanked her with his eyes. Tarth rose out of the sea as it always had for her, as blue as summer's last sky and as uncompromising as stone. Evenfall Hall was sails furled and quiet-gated in winter, but her father received her in a solar that smelled of lemon oil, with a quilted doublet and hair thinner than she remembered. He hadn't seen her in years. He had never not loved her. He had also never known what to do with the love. They had both grown older inside the dilemma. "Brienne," he said, and the word was both relief and apology. "Father," she said, and went to one knee because sometimes the language of childhood was the only tongue that said what it should. Selwyn Tarth, called the Evenstar because his heraldry had turned into a sobriquet that clung even in ordinary rooms, lifted her up, stepped back to look, and then embraced her properly, as a father should. "Your mother," he said, and stopped, because her mother was 30 years gone on a wet road, and there was only so much to be said about absence. "Jon Snow is king in the north," Brienne said when they had sat. Podrick somewhere with a tray and a girl with a jug and her father's steward as silent and efficient as ever. "Winter is upon them, and it will be upon you soon enough, father. He sent me to ask for the thing we have most and have always had, the knowledge of the sea and small honest ships. We need grain from the Mander and the Arbor and a passage that won't kill it." "You want me to break with the Iron Throne openly," Selwyn said with no heat. "To spit in the general direction of the Lannisters and whatever passes for their rule now that King's Landing has become a rumor of ash and bad wine. And you want me to do it for a northern boy with the Stark look about him." "I want you to do it for the living," Brienne said, less gently than she had meant to. She forced herself to breathe. "Father, the dead are moving." This is not a tale men tell to frighten children from the woods. I have seen wildlings who refuse to break their own dead for fear of what they would rise as. I have heard a man named Beric, who has died and returned more times than the mercy of it can contain, speak of a purpose that is not ours to define. The winter you have known is a playful thing compared to what's coming. I ask for ships and grain because men understand those words. What I am asking for is your courage. Selwyn's eyes pricked. Then his mouth compressed as if to hold the feeling in its place. You've always been your mother's daughter, he said. And then you were yours. You keep finding ways to stand straighter. He reached for parchment. You shall have the Tarth galleys we can spare and letters to houses who still answer when I speak. Karen of Night Song has had his pride turned into ribs for years. He will enjoy remembering he still has a voice. Grandison owes me a child's ransom. Fell is stubborn but not cruel. Dondarrion is... He stopped and shook his head with a small, sorrowing motion. More legend than lordship now, but there are others. I will call them to Evenfall Hall, and we shall see who still wants to stand in daylight. The marchers came in from the hills with their coats smelling of pony and smoke. Wary because caution had become a habit these last years. Their faces held the weather like maps. They had the old Baratheon loyalty in the backs of their throats if one spoke the name correctly. And they had the Lannisters' bribes in their pockets because starvation has no ideology. Brienne stood in her father's hall while Selwyn Tarth explained in careful, measured words that the choice before them was not between king and pretender, but between admitting the world was larger and darker than their fathers had told them and pretending that the sea could be cancelled by closing one's eyes. Some men pledged ships, because ships were wood and rope and could be counted. Some men pledged grain because grain rotted if it did not get moved. Some men pled the need to consult their wives or their maesters or their gods and did none of those things, choosing instead to wait to see which way the wind blew and how hot the dragonfire would run. Brienne did not love them, but she did not despise them either. She had learned to recognize fear when she met it wearing names like caution and prudence. When the meetings followed one after another until the days blurred into a pattern of candles consumed and new candles set, Brienne felt the impatient part of herself. Never large, always hungry, open its mouth. South. She had promised the north she would go south. And if she did not push on, she would sink into Tartha's own old comforts and drown on dry land. She kissed her father's cheek the way a daughter kisses her first harbor, and she embarked again with Podrick and 3 of her father's sworn men and a packet of letters that smelled of lemon oil and wax. They made landfall at Massey's Hook and took horses' tea. Hin-hipped from the winter pasture but sure-footed, the Dornish marches spread ahead, all brown bones and old grudges. Brienne had bled on these roads, once, for a king whose heart had been a green laurel wreath that burned when it should have shaded. She knew where streams hid in the shadow of stones and where shadier men waited. She did not fear them. She had learned to fear the failure of simple tasks. Eat, sleep, keep a promise. They saw the riverlands through a screen of thorn and memory. Smoke hung sometimes where a farm had been burned for its grain. The man on the mill bridge tried to stop them with a smile and a spear. Brienne paid him in words and iron and left him with the latter after the former failed to feed his courage. A horse put a foot wrong and did not finish the day. They bartered for another with Oathkeeper's name, which had begun to mean more in men's heads than the facets in its hilt. And Brienne hated how the sword opened doors where truth staggered. Rumors went faster than ravens. A fry fell into his own moat. Another choked on a pie. Old Lord Walder was dead, and he had died in a way that made both the gods laugh and frown. Brienne did not trouble to sort tale from truth. The effect was the same. The Freys were distracted, the twins outriders less certain than their old scorn would have had them, and the river itself harder to bully than any man. She sent a letter under seal to Highgarden from a village where they had cheese and more books than one expected in farmers' hands. If those books were mostly prayer books and lives of saints who had died of diseases the healers now had names for. Then she sent another to a name she had never thought to write, Jaime Lannister. She wrote it with her gauntlets off, because a woman's hand writing to a man who had once called her beauty on a bridge and meant it had a weight she would not hide behind iron. She wrote, "There is a parley to be had, where the Ashford Road meets the Old Sept whose stones are warm even in winter. Come if you remember mercy. Come if you remember oaths. Come if you do not wish to see the realm torn into rags while winter wipes its mouth with us. And she did not sign it with the name that had once gotten her laughed at. She signed it Brienne of Tarth because she had made the name mean other things. He came. She knew him from a distance by the way he sat a horse. Casually, as if the animal and he had shared a body long enough to quarrel and reconcile 100 times. He had the golden hand, which caught light like a small, permanent noon. His hair had grown out and the cold had chiseled a new line into his mouth that had not been there when he'd been all careless arrogance. Brienne felt something in her chest shift and then settle, like a sword in a well-made scabbard. Podrick shifted too, because he was young and he witnessed everything as if it had meaning beyond the surface of it, which it did. Bronn came with him because Bronn came with anyone who had a purse and a problem, and because Podrick's past had a way of sidling up to his future and calling it names. Bronn grinned when he saw the boy and said, "You've not died yet then?" And Podrick looked absurdly pleased by the insult. Jaime stopped just out of reach because he had learned a few things since the last time they'd stood in the bracelet of each other's company. He took off his glove with his teeth and looked down at the hand he no longer had, as if to teach it how to behave, then put the glove back and swung off the horse with an economy Brienne had always appreciated when she had not yet catalogued it as a desire. "Brienne," he said. "Ser Jaime." They stood 10 feet apart and winter collected itself around them like an uncertain audience. "You wrote quickly," he said, as if it were something to admire. "I write as I speak," she said. "Straight. It's a fault when a man wants lies." "I've had lies enough," he said, a weariness almost softening the shape of his mouth. "What do you want?" "For the living not to die because pride makes men deaf. Cersei will let the north bleed as long as it makes the snow red rather than gold. Highgarden will send grain if the Lannisters don't burn it first to make a point. Dorne will send spears if anyone who speaks for them longer than a day lives to finish a sentence. I'm going south to ask. I'm going to Highgarden and then to Sunspear and then to Old Town if their maesters will listen. I'm asking you to use what remains of your honor to keep me from being stopped by your people on roads you've always counted as yours." "One letter to Randall Tarley," Jaime said. "Another to the man who thinks he rules Blackwater Bay. And you think, what? That they'll care because I asked? Because the Kingslayer snapped his golden fingers. Because Jaime Lannister wrote it," Brienne said, and watched his face open and close and then hold. "Because there are men who still believe you did what you did at the September of Baelor and on the Trident not for glory but for the lives it saved. Because somewhere under your knighthood and your mockery you wanted to be worthy of that white cloak you wore until your sister asked you to use it as a towel." His eyes flashed, not with anger so much as something that asked not to have certain doors open too quickly. Then he laughed without joy. "You've sharpened your tongue along with your sword." "My sword has always been sharp enough," she said. "Words are harder. I'll write the letters," he said, as if conceding a small skirmish, then paused and let his gaze slide down the length of Oathkeeper as it lay against her shoulder. "You kept the name. It suits," she said. They both looked at the blade and remembered a bear pit and other pits made of other materials. He signed in a hand he had taught himself with his left. Slow, precise, as if he had learned to write again the way a child learns to stand, with a fall for every step, until the steps outnumbered the falls. E.g. Ave, her 2 letters, and a look that asked questions he did not voice because they both knew the answers would cost too much and buy them nothing they could keep. Bronn clapped Podrick on the shoulder, perhaps harder than necessary, and said, "Don't let her get herself killed. Be dull if you can. Dull men live longer." And Pod, dead earnest, nodded as if he'd been given a recipe. Highgarden sat like a dream too rich to wear every day. When Brienne had ridden there with Renly, it had been summer and everything had been perfumed almost to pain. Roses and hope and the sort of future that thinks it is inevitable. Now, the roses had gone to hips, and the scent had dwindled to the whole winter's worth of herbs hanging in the period rooms and the clean iron of sharpened scythes. The banners hung anyway, because the reach would die with a fork in one hand and a carving knife in the other. Olenna Tyrell received her in a solar whose chairs were too low for Brienne's knees and whose windows were inset like sly eyes. She had a headscarf that made a joke of saffron, and she carried her age the way other women carried lovers, with familiarity and a degree of amused contempt. "You are not who I expected," Olenna said after scanning the letters and nodding as if the words had mostly been hers before she read them. "I expected a raven with a rag tied to its foot, and a boy who stutters, and 3 baskets of northern snow packed around several dead fish." Brienne bowed more awkwardly than she wished and did not care. "I can stutter if it helps, my lady." "It won't," Olenna said. "I'm too old to be charmed by sincerity. I only want results." Her eyes softened then, despite herself. "You served Lady Catelyn. You tried to save a girl the world measured with ropes and rings. You endured Renly's tent with dignity. See, take a honey cake. Convince me to give you what I was going to give you anyway." Brienne sat. The cake was absurd. She ate it neatly and her hands did not shake. "The Lannisters burned the only people in King's Landing with a talent for smelling rot," Olenna said, almost to herself. "They left my lovely granddaughter as ash. They left my son as ash. My house remains, because the gods are sloppy and careless, and because spite keeps old women on their feet when wisdom says lie down and die." She speared Brienne with her gaze. "And now you bring me a plea for grain and a promise to spend my men's lives in frost and darkness, against enemies who won't be bribed or seduced or penned in with rivers. Bless you for picking a simple war." "It's not a war," Brienne said. "It's a season. You don't win a season. You survive it. If you help the North survive, there will be anyone left to eat your grain come spring. If you don't, winter will come for you slower, but in the end it doesn't care whether it walks or runs." Olenna leaned back like a magistrate pretending to be a grandmother. "I will send grain," she said. "Not enough. It will never be enough. I will send some men who are old enough to remember a time when honor wasn't a girl's name. They'll complain about their joints and the food and the cold, and then they'll die. And if there is a world left after they do, the Reach will praise them and promptly forget them. I will also send letters to Dorne. Ilaria Sand pretends to be a different kind of snake, but she's only ever wanted revenge. I will tell her there is a new way to get it, by being the last one alive to give it a name. And I will send someone to Old Town to whisper in the ears of men who think books are boats. They can be if you load them properly." "Thank you," Brienne said, because it was the only true phrase left after everything else had been carved away. "Don't thank me," Olenna said. "Bring me proof that there is still a world in which thanks have weight. Have a second cake if you like. You look like someone who needs the calories." They slept in rooms that made Podrick's eyes go comically wide and Brienne's go narrow with the effort of fitting her body through furniture built by men who thought height was rudeness. She woke in the night to the sound of a harp somewhere beyond the arcade and thought of Renly, and then refused him the luxury of her grief because that was a coin that had already been spent and could not be minted again. In the morning they rode south, crossing the Mander at a ford where the water rose to a horse's belly and then fell away as if the river itself had changed its mind. They could have gone west, but there were lions there, and men who wore lions on their chests did not know how to entertain a guest with grace. Brienne had Randall Tarley's letter anyway, with Jaime's crabbed left-handed script making careful little stabs into the parchment. It might open a gate, or it might get her killed. Neither prospect held priority over the fact of what she had said she would do. Old Town lifted its white tower into the gray with all the arrogance it had earned. The high tower's beacon burned, day and night, as if to remind the sun of its obligations. The citadel crouched like an island of stone and opinion, and Brienne felt a sentiment close to stage fright, because she had always held book-learned men as something apart, another species that did not require feeding and warmth and the patience to mend straps and stir pottage. They had their own hungers. She just did not often have to feed them. The Archmaester who took them in was called a brose, and he had eyes like a man who has buried more children in books than most men bury in earth. He listened, which was a novelty among powerful Southerners. When he spoke, his words were wrapped in caution, like knives in cloth. "This is not the Citadel's war," he said, kindly and with a fatigue that sat on his shoulders like an old hound. "It is not," Brienne agreed. "Nor was it the Citadel's war when the Undulls came across. But here you are and here we are because men wrote down how to farm and how to sail without H." hugging the coast, and what herbs keep a wound from turning bad. This isn't a war. It's weather made murder. Send your ravens. White ravens, if you like, to make men look up and remember the color of their fear. Tell them winter is more than a word we say when we want to feel brave. Ibro's mouth quirked, as if it wished to be amused and was not sure it had license. And if we tell them, will they listen? Perhaps not, Brienne said. But in my experience, men don't listen because a thing isn't said loudly enough, or by someone they respect. The citadel is a bell. Ring. It was not the eloquence of the speech that did it, she knew. It was that the citadel had begun, late and grudging and honest, to receive reports that did not fit within the tidy shelves of their worldview. It was that men had arrived missing parts that were not the parts a sword normally took off a body. It was that they could see their own breath in the mornings for weeks longer than they thought proper. Ibro's sent his ravens. Their flight clawed at her sternum the way music sometimes did, making a feeling that was not sorrow and not elation but a tangled thing she had no use for on the road and could only feel without understanding. Lady Brienne? The voice was hesitant and warm. She turned and there he was, round-faced still, though the citadel had put angles on him the way a severe tailor might put a man into a more becoming posture. Samwell Tarly, with ink on his fingers and hope in his hands. I know you. From the wall. You wore black, Brienne said, delighted because here was a good man, one of the stubbornly decent few, who made the world less lonely merely by standing in it. I still do, Sam said, tugging at his sleeve. Some of the time. I send books north because if the dead march, swords will be less use than what lies in those covers. Look. He fumbled with a wrapped packet in the pocket of his maester's robe and held up a page with a hand so gentle you'd think it might bruise the parchment. A map of an island like a beast at rest with its head raised. Dragonstone. There's dragonglass under it. Mountains of it. John needs this. If he can't get fire to walk, then let him give his men the next best thing. Brienne looked and felt the strong, practical joy of a woman who has been given a tool that will not fail her grip. Thank you, she said, and Sam flushed and mumbled and then looked up again, the courage he'd gathered at the wall not yet spent. Also, he said in one breath, if you're going to Dorne, please don't let them poison you. I like you. Duly noted, Brienne said gravely, and left Old Town with Podrick full of fish and facts and her own heart steadier than it had been. Because there are days when the world meets you halfway and doesn't take your hand only to cut it. They sailed around the long, sly heel of Dorne and came up on Sunspear through a bright morning that was somehow warm even in winter. Dorne's color was like a song sung by a different throat. Copper skin, black hair, citrus and salt, and a refusal to be arranged by anyone else's rhythms. Ilaria Sands sat on a low couch with a lacquered table in front of her and daughters draped near, as if they were beautiful cats with more claws than expected. Brienne tasted the instinct to distrust them because their grief had turned into a weapon. She put that aside as carefully as one sets down a dish that is both dangerous and necessary. The North sends a knight, Ilaria said, tapping the seal with one finger. A woman in armor, which is either a promise or a threat. A woman, Brienne said evenly, whose life is made of oaths kept. I have none of your skill in the dance of tongues. I have this, a request for aid and a truth I suspect you already believe, because you have always understood the cost of winter even in summer. The dead are coming. Everything I love is already dead, Ilaria said, her eyes going flat in the way only grief accomplishes. And the Lannisters breathe anyway. Then help me build a world where they will answer for what they breathed away, Brienne said. Help me build a world. To do that, we must keep it from ending. Ilaria laughed then, a short, unwilling sound not unlike the bark of a seal. She looked at one of her daughters. Obara? Spears, Obara said, her arms crossbow bowstring tight. We can send 10 companies, no. We can promise 10 and send 7 and hope for 9. Sunspear will not empty itself for ghosts while the Reach sniffs at our borders. But we can pledge men to ride to the Boneway and hold it if anything comes through alive that should not. Nymeria, ravens, Nymeria said, and quiet knives. If your letters to Highgarden are opened by men with lion pins, We will know soon enough to stop their hands. Tyene, prayers, Tyene said, her smile almost sweet. And some little bottles. Men think poison is a woman's art. They forget that fear is everyone's. Ilaria spread her hands. We will join your winter. It will give us a new way to bleed. Brienne had learned long ago that coalition is ugly when seen from the back. She bowed to the ugly and made it a gate. She left Sunspear with more than she had arrived with and less than she wanted, and accepted that this was the nature of bargaining with people, not gods. She put what she had into Pod's satchel, and into the heads of her men, and into her own spine. The road north would make use of it. News traveled as always faster than her horse. Euron Greyjoy had made a proposal to a queen in King's Landing, as if marriage were a rope he could use to moor 2 ships together and then set them afire. Randall Tarley had declared something to someone. The Reach was a net of loyalties pulled too tight. Over all this the winter lay like a hand. They crossed the Red Mountains with the air thin and clean, as if someone had laid a blade across the sky and sliced a part away. They came upon the site of an old battle, unmarked save for tea. He changed in how the grass grew when it grew over iron. It was late afternoon when the Brotherhood without banners found them, outlined in the weak lemon of a winter sun dropping behind ridge and thorn. Beric Dondarrion rode like a man who had made a pact with the aches of his bones and had decided to live longer than anyone expected. Thuras had blood in his beard, and there were fewer of them than she remembered. They had fewer words too, which was a blessing. "We've seen the cold," Beric said, after they had shared bread that did not trouble to be called fresh and wine that was colder than the sky and tasted more honest because of it. "We've seen eyes that hold no human thing. We are headed north because if there is a place where the fire might stand, it is where the world has learned already to live with less than it wants." "I am headed south then north," Brienne said. "I am a shuttle between things that believe they have nothing to do with one another. I am taking thread through a stubborn cloth." Beric laughed. The sound took 10 years off his face and then put them back with interest. "You speak like an old woman who knows her loom. Good. The world will last as long as her loom holds." He looked toward the dark. "Keep your fire near." "I have none," she said lightly. "Only a blade." "Then you have fire," he said, and lifted his and made it flame. And for a moment the light snared in Oathkeeper's red, and everything around them was the color of heart's blood and persistence. They parted like roads that had always been one road, diverging on a map someone had drawn wrongly. Brienne and Pod walked their horses to spare them and spoke little. At night she lay with her hand on Oathkeeper, not because she feared thieves, but because the old blade had a way of reminding her of the weight of vows. She found that comfort. They skirted King's Landing because King's Landing beneath Cersei was not a place for honest errands. She looked at the city from a hill, the black tooth of the September broken and the red keep a slash against the sky, and thought of Sansa's child eyes and the way they had not been turned to ash. She thought of Jaime in that place, pacing with his golden hand and his memory of a younger self who had believed in impossible things. She closed her eyes and returned to the road because romantic sorrow would do no work for her at all. Dragonstone was black and old and nearer to the sky than the sea when the tide fell away. They had not meant to land there yet, but winter storms decide where journeys break and begin. Brienne had not expected to be received. She had expected to camp under the lee of one of those dragonhead towers and pretend she did not hear the sea's teeth. Instead, the beach guards, their armor plain, their discipline the kind that comes only when someone has taught it more by example than threat, brought her up past a gate that remembered dragons more vividly than any living man, and she found herself standing before a woman whose hair was almost white and almost silver and almost storm's foam, and whose eyes contained a weather Brienne could not judge. "I am Daenerys Stormborn," the woman said, and the titles came after like surf. Brienne bowed and gave her name and thought of the time she had imagined dragons only as painted would under a summer moon. "I bring you a message from the king in the north. Jon Snow asks your aid." Tyrion Lannister stood to the queen's right like a man who had forgotten that he could still be tired and was doing it anyway. His eyes crinkled, not with humor exactly, but with the recognition that once upon a time all the people who thought themselves clever had thought him the least dangerous man in a room. "Lady Brienne," he said, "I never forget a woman who carries a sword as if it were an instrument and not an ornament. His mouth made a little twitch. I hear you've been busy taking oaths and keeping them even when it hurts. You'd make a terrible Lannister. I tried, she said, unexpectedly at ease. The gold clashed with my eyes. He laughed, a sound that seemed surprised to find itself at large. Jon Snow wants dragonglass, Daenerys said, cutting through the pleasantries with a queen's prerogative. I have it. I want his fealty. Tell me why I should give him one without the other. Because you will want to believe that you did not sit a dragon in the middle of a field and decide that the only thing you could ever be was a conqueror, Brienne said. Aware that Podrick's hands had gone taut on the reins and Tyrion had lifted his chin as if to warn her and tell her she was doing a difficult thing correctly. Because you will want, someday, to know that when the world teetered, you did not ask a man who told you the truth to kneel before he had beds for his people. Because he will never ask you to bend if the cost is the world. He will not sell it for pride. If you are what men say you are, neither will you. Silence, the kind that grows berries and poison both, filled the space between them. Then Daenerys smiled, and it was like a thing that had learned in childhood how to be fierce and had later been taught how to be compassionate, and now did both with a woman's odd grace. Mind the glass, she said. Bring your king. We will speak of oaths when we speak eye to eye. Tyrion walked with Brienne to the gate when she left. His limp was as honest as her scars. I've written to my brother, he said low. I told him what you asked of him. He will come north because he wants to tell himself he's a better man than the world believes. He may be right. Men are what they do, Brienne said. And women, Tyrion said. But sometimes we get a different measure. He lifted his hand in farewell, and for a moment she saw in him the boy he might have been if his father had been capable of loving anyone who did not look like himself. The return north was a collage of villages and fords and the sudden violence that comes over the horizon for no reason anyone can see, because the reason lies in a man's head, and that is an undiscoverable country. They avoided a Lannister patrol by walking the horses chest deep through a freezing stream under willow boughs that hung like the hair of a drowned girl. One of Tartha's men took an arrow in his arm and did not mention it until Podrick saw the blood. Brienne cut the shaft off with clean, decisive strokes and told him a story about a time she had broken her nose, because the man needed something to listen to that was not the singing in his ears. It was snowing by the time the neck opened its long, damp mouth and took them in. The reeds whispered, and something that might have been a crane or might have been a man's soul moved in the corner of her sight and did not trouble to introduce itself. Howland Reed did not meet them because he had learned long ago that the best of men lost their way in these waters. Instead, he sent his daughter's boy, half frog and half human, who told them where to ride so that the bog did not decide to eat the horses. The boy wore green and smelled of mud. He had a grin like a knife handle polished by use. Your king, he said, is sending men to the last hearth. He says to tell you you'll be fed the moment your horse is in the yard. And, he added with a gravity that made him look 6 years older, a raven came. Why, it means something. I don't know what. He did not ask who the white raven was for. One did not ask. The message carried itself in the bird's feathers. Winterfell rose like a memory that had learned a new trick. When Brienne passed under the gate, she felt the warmth of the forges on her face like an intimate breath. She did not expect to mind the smell of dung and leather and wet wool the way she did not expect to love the sound of men cursing each other over small nothings. She just did. It meant life. Sansa met her first, because Sansa had arranged herself to meet messengers first. Before anyone had the chance to rehearse their news into something it was not. Sansa took the letters as if they were loaves hot from an oven and glanced at their edges with the domesticated speed of a woman who had been both hostage and hostess too often. Jon came in after because someone had delayed him with questions he would answer now rather than defer, and because he was a man who had learned the cost of delay and paid it rather than pass it to someone else. You're well, he said to Brienne, and the words were weighty for not being many. Well enough, she said. She wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him of lemon groves and quiet knives and the way Jaime Lannister had looked at Oathkeeper without asking to touch the blade that had once been a lord's grief. She wanted to say little. She chose the middle road. Highgarden will send grain and more. Dorne will send spears and something that's not quite trust but not quite not. Old Town has sent white ravens. Daenerys Targaryen will let us mine the dragon's glass. She asks that you come. Tyrion Lannister says that Jaime will come north to speak. The council that followed had the iron taste of a thing held between teeth while a man runs. Yohn Royce wanted to say that dragons were a hazard. Davos admitted that he'd seen worse hazards that had never saved a soul. Lyanna Mormont told men twice her size that they were cowards and then grinned like a cub when they laughed because fear makes people cherish laughter wherever it appears. Tormund Giantsbane leaned back in his chair like a man trying to remember how one sits indoors and said the only queen he'd follow would have a beard. The room laughed again and then grew sober because there were queens coming who did not. Maester Wolkan read the White Raven's letter with care, and winter in its official capacity. Documented, sealed, settled over the north like a ledger's last sum. They sent riders south with messages. They sent ravens to houses who would only hear truth if it arrived wearing a wax seal. Jon looked at Brienne after the hall had emptied of the loudest voices and became quiet again, as if it had been a bell that had found its note and now let it die. "You've done what I asked," he said, and the rare undercurrent of relief in his tone felt like being allowed to sit after a long watch. "More, probably." "I spoke," she said. "They listened. Some will move. Some will not. Some will wait. That is what people do." "And what do we do?" Sansa asked, not as a challenge, but as a woman asking the friend she trusts to say the thing aloud that she has already concluded. "We prepare to fight," Brienne said. "We feed who can be fed. We keep the smiths working until they think of nails in their sleep. We send to Dragonstone for glass, and we put it into hands that won't drop it when the cold looks at them. And we make room," she added, more softly than she had meant to, "for a Lannister who may keep an oath because I told him he still might." It was not many days later when Jaime Lannister came, wrapped in furs as if he were a man trying on humility to see if it fitted. He had come without many men, which had been wise and helped no one's sense of safety. He walked into Winterfell's great hall and Brienne felt the way the room took him in with a long, unbending look. Sansa stood on the dais with Jon, whose expression was the open, careful one of a man determined not to let old stories tell him who stands before him now. Jaime took in the banners, the dire wolf, the bear, the merman, and inclined his head to them as if to the dead who had worn them. "I come not as an envoy of the queen," he said, his voice carrying in the old room like a rumor that refuses to die even when the man who started it is long in his grave. "I come because there is a war against the living that my house has spent a long time pretending does not exist. I come because I have killed a king to save a city, and I do not mind killing pride to save the world." Sansa's mouth tightened, not because she disbelieved him, but because she believed him in a way that cost her pride. "We will feed you," she said. "We will not make you comfortable." "I've been comfortable all my life," he said. "It never taught me anything." They put him in a tower room with a view of the Godswood, because Sansa was clever and because Winterfell had a sense of humor. Brienne climbed the steps that evening because she was not a coward in any way that mattered, and because she had business with the man who had written letters and kept his word. He opened the door as she lifted her hand to knock, which made them both smile despite themselves. "You've done it," he said. "No," she said. "I have started it." He looked out at the heart tree and then back at her, and then he did a very Lannister thing and made it plain, because he had learned plainness from a woman who beat him repeatedly with it until he decided not to bleed from the blows. "I'm glad you're alive." "Me too," she said, and they stood in companionable silence until words would have complicated a simple, impossible moment. The Winterfell that followed was all tasks. Men fought in the yard with spears tipped with black, hard-gloss stone that felt wrong in the air and right in the hand. Smiths beat stubbornness out of iron in a rhythm like the heart's own. Boys fetched water until they learned how to make neglect do it faster, and women stuffed oats into pouches and hope into children with equal grim practicality. The ravens came and went like thoughts, and sometimes white shook its feathers among the brown and the black. Brienne slept little. When she did, she dreamt of oceans with no coasts and fields with no dead. A council was called at Moat Cailin, the old ruin in the neck that had outlasted conquerors the way a stone outlasts water's temper. It was neutral ground if anything in the world could be called that. The road in was a stitched wound. The towers were the broken teeth of an elder, and the air was the kind that makes lungs work for every comfort. And yet it was a place men could come to without feeling that their fathers glared behind them from tapestries. That mattered. They came. The banners lifted, damp and stubborn, along the road. Tyrell rose, and the leaping trout of the riverlands carried in a hand that shook because it had been long since a Tully standard had been borne openly. The sun and moon quarters of Tarth that Brienne had seen since she was taller than a saddle. From Dorne came a plain orange banner, because Illyria had said formalities and symbols were for later, and Brienne had not argued. Jon Royce's falcon appeared, and Brienne watched him speak to a knot of Northmen with the relish of a man who has been waiting to make himself useful again. And there, small as a fingernail but singing to her eye anyway, came a banner of a golden lion on red. They met in the shattered hall. There was no dais. There were no high tables. Brienne found herself not in front of Sansa or Jon, but among Jon Royce and an old marcher lord with a face like a fence post, and a boy from House Reed whose eyes were green as moss and far less decorative. Jaime stood where he could interpose himself between arguments and death without having to reach far. Olenna had not come in person. She had sent a cousin with a mind like a ledger and a better one like a knife. Dorne's emissary was a woman with a scar across one cheek, and when she smiled you could see the person she had been before the scar and the person she'd become after. There were speeches because men loved to hear themselves persuade themselves, and there were statements so brief they might have been ciphers. There was an attempt by a Tarly man, one of Randall's younger cousins, to sneer at the North, which was cut short when 24 Northmen stared at him, as if he were a tree they were considering cutting down and hadn't yet decided how much wood he would yield. There were suggestions, and there were suggestions disguised as questions, and there were those rare useful questions that turn a room. Through all of it, Brienne watched and thought and placed words where words would make structures instead of debris. At the end, she said, when the conversations had become arguments and the arguments wanted to become blood, we need something simple. We need a pact that can be spoken even by a man too hungry to pronounce titles. We need a promise a child can understand. We will not fight each other until the dead are dead. You ask us to trust enemies, said the Tyrell cousin, whose accounting of grain stores had made him respectable, if not loved. I ask you to trust the rules of winter, Brienne said. In winter, we do not choose which neighbor to feed because we've always hated his father. We feed him because the barn has one door and he is standing there with a bowl. And when spring comes? Asked the Marcher Lord, likely already thinking of long grudges he had managed to fold into his boots for the past few hours. Then we will see, Brienne said. We will stand in a world that had a chance to exist, and we will decide whether to make it better. You can break your pact then. I hope you won't. A murmur, like the sea catching at the edge of a rock and reconsidering it, ran through the room. Men looked at each other and decided whether they could survive for a season without being themselves. In the end, they could. They signed. Wax seals went down like small suns on the parchment. Podrick held the sand when the Tyrell cousin needed it for the wax. The cousin thanked him, and Podrick blushed, and Brienne made a note of all the small courtesies that make survival less barbarous. Randall Tarly's banners did not come, but the men he had thought to send to disrupt the council came late, and badly, and were turned away by a combination of old reeds and new resolve. One of them, desperate, hungry for honor like food, reached for his sword at the wrong moment, and a reed boy's dart took his hand like a blessing. Jon Royce told him quietly that he would die if he did not learn the order of things. The man learned. He would be useful later guarding a wagon of grain. That, too, was narration. When they returned to Winterfell, the new compact in their saddlebags and on their tongues, Brienne walked to the Godswood. The air was knife clean. The heart tree watched with its old bleeding sarcasm. She knelt and did not pray because prayer had never fit her as well as action. But she thought of the dead. She named them, Renly, Catelyn, men whose names were lost except to their mothers. She named the living, Sansa, Jon, Podrick, whose earnestness was a sort of grace, Jaime, whose best self had long ago been asked to apologize for existing by everyone he had loved. She named her father. She stood, because the cold was working its way into her marrow, and there was only so much sentiment in the day's work. Jon found her there, He had snow in his hair and a look like a man learning to relieve himself of a weight for a moment before putting it back on because he was too stubborn to step aside. "They signed," he said. "They did," she said. "Enough of them." He nodded, as if this had been the answer all along. "I want you to be the one who speaks to them when I cannot," he said then, with as little ceremony as he had used the night they had asked her to go south. "The title is worth less than the work. The work is to hold this together as the fire burns and the dark comes and men remember their old loves and old hates. Will you?" She had been waiting for someone to ask the thing she was already doing. "I will," she said, and the vow slid easily into place beside the others. Sansa came later with a roll of parchment and a small hard smile. "I have written to Lord Tarth," she said, "to thank him for his ships. I have also written to Lady Olenna in a tone that suggests gratitude disguised as something more regal. I think she will like it. And to Dorne, where I have said little and meant much." She looked around the Godswood as if to make sure it would not disapprove of her for being the sort of woman she had taught herself to become. "I wonder, sometimes, whether the gods care which of us holds the quill so long as the ink writes what the world needs." "The old gods watch," Brienne said. "They may do nothing else. That is enough." Winter thickened. The glass came from Dragonstone on ships that made their way by courage and stubborn inshore steering. Men learned to work it without cutting themselves open, which in turn taught them how to hold sharp things gently. Food came overland like a tired possibility, and it was portioned before it was eaten. Jon Royce drilled boys who grew in their armor like saplings try on a storm. Tormund cursed until cursing became a warmth and then softened when little ones came into the yard with sticks and stabbed his legs and shouted about giants in their blood. The night that Jaime Lannister met with Tyrion in a small corner of a larger room, Brienne stood with her back to the door and did not listen. Some kindnesses do their work best when they are not recorded. When the first forerunners of the dead came in sight of men who still breathed and had a word for fear, the ravens flew and the horns sounded and Winterfell learned what its stones had been laid for. But that was later. For now, Brienne walked the line between tents and fires, her breath clouding, her sword at her back with the steadiness of a hand on her shoulder, and she did the thing she had set out to do without knowing its name. She held the world together. She found Podrick asleep leaning against a barrel and put a cloak over him. He murmured thanks in his dream, polite even in rest. She passed by where Gendry, who'd reached them burdened with the fact of his parentage like a weight he had carried through streets too narrow for it, worked at a portable forge making heads for spears with a focus that excluded the cold. She saw Jaime speaking softly to a boy he'd just corrected in the yard. The boy had flinched twice and then stopped flinching, because kindness can be trained and cruelty can be unlearned. She looked up at the sky and it was clear, stars like frozen nails hammered into black wood. She did not ask them for anything. She had what she needed, and when she slept, finally, with her boots off and her hair unbraided and the ache in her shoulders like a song someone else was singing, she dreamed not of battle, but of a road that ran south and north at once, and of the sound the sea makes when it forgives you for leaving, and of a woman with honey cakes and a tongue sharper than a sword in her old age, and of a man with a golden hand who had learned how to hold difficult truths without crushing them. The dream lasted until dawn, which was mercy, and when she woke, she put her feet on the cold floor willingly, because duty, when married to love, becomes a thing one does not dread. There were skirmishes then, here and there, along the ice-hard lanes that ran between Winterfell and the little farms that had always fed it. Ravens came with news of men in the south who moved cautiously along the pact like a brittle plank. Some broke and fell through, others crossed and found their footing. Olenna's grain was waylaid once by men with Tarly badges whose captain had decided to make his own policy. Dorne's orange banner appeared in the nick of time, and the captain reconsidered the mathematics of survival. White Harbor's docks were a ballet of crates and curses. Davos moved through them like a man who knew the steps and had decided to dance anyway. Amid all this, Brienne became something she had not expected to be. A person people sought to tell truth to, instead of the version of truth that made them look brave. She learned to listen differently. She learned to say the unsayable in words that did not make men ashamed. She stood beside Sansa and watched the girl who had crossed T. He south like a firewalker become a woman whose poise never pretended not to be pain-taught manners. She stood beside John and felt his decisions passing through him like weather through trees. Sometimes they bow, sometimes they break, sometimes they stand. She stood beside Jaime and remembered that mercy is also a discipline. And when, at last, the horns did call and the dead did arrive, not as a myth, but as bodies that moved without breath and eyes without pupils, she took her place without ceremony, as she always had. But even as the cold reached into places warm wool and courage could not protect, Brienne carried into that night the warmth of a southern sun tempered by old women, brash girls, and men who had relearned how to measure themselves by deeds. She had brought winter its allies. She had brought the south north in wagons and promises and sharpened stones and the refusal to look away. She stood in the breach where the yard stacked rabbits and spear shafts and men who had fallen and would stand no more. She made Oathkeeper sing her familiar song of not yet, and the world listened because it had learned to, because she had spent months teaching it how. And when dawn came, thin and questionable, Brienne of Tarth smiled inside her helm, not because the war was won, but because her oaths held them, her everything she recognized as worth the bleeding. Later, when they counted who had not fallen and who had risen in the wrong way and then fallen again, people would say that the pact made at Moat Cailin saved more than it cost, and that a northern king and his southern knight had done something impossible without asking praise. People would find a way to tell the story with more dragons and fewer letters. People would write songs that made jokes out of lemons and roses and a boy whose honesty was a stronger drink than wine. And perhaps, in some warm room years hence with apples in a wooden bowl and a page of parchment weighed down by a knife on the table's corner, someone would say Brienne of Tarth went south as an envoy and returned not with triumph but with a pattern, and that pattern held when men's fear alone would not. If someone asked her then what she had done, she would not say much. She would look out a window and find the horizon because it settled her spine, and she would say, "I spoke, I listened, I kept going." And those who understood would nod, and those who didn't would say it sounded simple, and she would smile and let them keep their illusions, because the world was heavy and she knew when to put down an extra weight. She walked the battlements in the pale morning after the long night of lesser battles and watched the little knots of people below, making tea, mending straps, telling jokes with their hands. Jaime came and leaned his elbows on the merlin beside her like a man who had forgotten he was once incapable of leaning on anything. They stood easily. "You were right," he said gently, as if it mattered less to be right than to have done the right thing. "I am not often," she said. "You are," he said, "but perhaps right isn't the word." He gestured with his golden hand, which was catching dawn and tossing it back like a game. "True, that's just as dangerous," Brienne said, and he laughed quietly, and someone below shouted about oats, and someone else swore at a donkey, and a far-off raven made an observation to the air. Podrick found them with news of fresh bread, which was a miracle worth traveling south for in itself. He said something about the Tyrell cousin learning to eat stew without complaining about the lack of herbs, and about a Dornish woman who had taught a northern boy to wrap cloth around his ears so they didn't freeze, and about Davos losing a wager about how many crates of glass a longboat could carry in a choppy sea. He had become a man while she had been watching him try, and that had felt better than victory. She listened and nodded and took the bread, and passed half to Jaime because generosity continues the line drawing from the heart to the hand, and because it tasted better shared. The day would bring new demands, and soon enough a southern queen would arrive with a dragon like a piece of night that chose when to be sky and when to be fire. Soon enough men would decide whether they preferred to die of cold or of pride. Soon enough the wars of humans would ask to be resumed, and some would oblige, and others would remember the contract they had signed with the living and decide that there was more honor in keeping it. But for now, there was strength in the wall she leaned on and warmth under the bread and the knowledge that she had been asked to do an impossible thing by a man whose face had learned the meaning of the word king, and that she had done as much of it as any human could. She had gone south. She had built a bridge out of syllables and stubbornness and placed her own body under it while others walked. She had returned with the living tied together by threads she had chosen carefully for their strength and give. Winter had not noticed all her labor, because winter notices nothing. The living had. That was enough.